Welcome back to Creepshow, where we uncover the dark and twisted stories lurking beneath the surface of history. Today, we delve into the chilling world of axe murders, a brutal and gruesome chapter in crime history that shocked communities and left lasting scars. From the shadows of 19th century homes to the unsettling silence of rural life, these stories reveal the terrifying ease with which a simple tool became a weapon of unimaginable horror. Get ready as we count down the top 10 most gruesome axe murders that will leave you questioning the darkness within humanity. Let's dive in. Axe murders were fairly common in the 19th century. A murderer could easily enter a home and chop the inhabitants to bits without disturbing or waking the neighbors. The axe was a silent and deadly instrument of death, and sadly many axe murders were never solved. Unlike murder by gun, an axe murder was generally gruesome. Chunks of flesh and brain would scatter the floor. The victim often did not die immediately and was sometimes hacked multiple times before death overcame them. The subject also sold newspapers, which is likely why so many axe murders received extensive coverage in the press at that time. Number 10, the Mudgee Tragedy. No one could believe it. Why would a retired police constable living in Mudgee, New South Wales, murder his wife and infant child? At first, when the news broke, some newspapers were inclined to believe there was a mistake. Surely it had to be a lie, but it wasn't. In September 1898, John McCoy snapped. He grabbed an axe and brutally battered the brains out of his wife and child. Neighbors had long suspected that the marriage was tense and that McCoy was often cruel to his wife. Mrs. McCoy had even hinted at her fears, suggesting that she worried John might one day murder her. Yet no one stepped in to help, convinced that McCoy wouldn't go that far. On the morning of the murder, screams echoed from their home. A young man ran over and witnessed McCoy striking his wife with the axe. Terrified, he fled to the police station to report the crime. When officers arrived, they were met with a grisly scene. There were pools of blood, clots of brains, and the murdered bodies of the woman and child. The infant had her head chopped open from the back. McCoy's wife had been hacked multiple times. The back of her head split open, with her brains smeared across the floor. McCoy was caught trying to clean himself off with a bucket of water, while his 3 sons remained unharmed nearby. At the inquest, McCoy claimed that his late wife had been the abuser, despite witnesses insisting he was the aggressor in the relationship. He even refused to pay for the burial of his wife and infant daughter. Ultimately, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to be hanged. Number 9. Butchered in a shanty. In the spring of 1858, Grand Rapids City, Wisconsin, was rocked by a horrific discovery when the butchered body of a woman was found inside a shanty. The scene was nothing short of gruesome. The small dwelling was drenched in blood, painting a chilling picture of violence. According to one report, the woman's head is literally chopped to pieces. The murderer gloated over his victim and mangled the lifeless corpse after he had murdered her. A blood-coated axe was found nearby, further implicating the brutality of the crime. As is often the case in such tragedies, suspicion quickly fell on the woman's husband, who was found in close proximity to the shanty. Patrick Bennett didn't deny his involvement, admitting to butchering his wife. He had a prior criminal record for robbery and was known to have a severe drinking problem, which painted a troubling picture of his character. What ultimately happened to Patrick Bennett after his arrest remains shrouded in mystery, leaving the community to grapple with the horror of what transpired within that shanty. The case serves as a stark reminder of the dark potential that lies within human relationships and the tragic outcomes that can result. Number 8. Deadly wage dispute. In 1888, Samuel H. Morris had found some success in New Zealand, which allowed him and his wife to move to Blacktown, NSW, where they purchased a small homestead. They hired a worker named Hing Lung to assist them, and for a time everything seemed to be going well. However, tensions escalated when Lung received 2 visitors one day, and Morris took immediate issue with their presence. He ordered them off his property, but Lung disregarded Morris's wishes, allowing the visitors to return to the hut where he lived. Not long after, Lung received a mysterious letter that visibly upset him, though he said nothing further about the matter. Shortly thereafter, Morris was sent by his wife to fetch some water. While he was bent over, Lung struck him violently over the head with a piece of wood, A struggle ensued, with Leung grabbing an axe and Morris picking up a garden hoe. In a chaotic exchange, Leung dealt Morris 2 hard blows to the head with the axe, and Morris retaliated with a blow from the hoe. Incredibly, Morris was still alive after the assault and managed to run toward the house, calling for his wife. But as she stepped out, she too was attacked by Leung, who struck her with the axe, breaking 3 of her ribs. She escaped and fled to a neighbor's house, located over 0.8 kilometers, 0.5 miles, away. By the time the neighbors arrived at the Morris homestead, it was too late. Morris had succumbed to an axe wound that had cut through his head. Leung was caught, attempting to crawl back to his hut. During his inquest, Leung claimed that the violent altercation stemmed from a dispute over unpaid wages. However, Morris's wife contradicted him, stating that there were no wages owed and suggesting that their attack was motivated by other reasons. Ultimately, Leung was found guilty of willful murder, but he died from his own wounds before he could stand trial for sentencing. Number 7. The Tall Man. In 1894, the body of Leroy Rogers, an old bachelor living on a small farm in Michigan, was discovered in a horrifying scene. His skull had been brutally crushed above one eye with the flat end of an axe, and the blade of the axe was still embedded in his neck. The body was still warm when a neighbor stumbled upon it, indicating that the murder had recently taken place. Yet there were no solid clues pointing to the identity of the killer. The only lead investigators had was a sighting of a tall man near the house, shortly before the murder. As they pieced together the case, the police concluded that robbery might have been the motive, as Leroy's gun and watch were missing. However, it seemed he had little else of value, making the crime all the more puzzling. The chilling brutality of Leroy's murder, combined with the lack of concrete evidence, left the community on edge and raised questions that lingered long after the tragedy. Number 6. A considerable mystery. In 1845, an odd and disturbing story unfolded in Parramatta, NSW, involving an old man and a young girl, believed to be around 14 or 15 years old. The two rented a house together, which raised suspicions among the neighbors. They speculated about the circumstances surrounding the young girl, whom the old man claimed as his daughter. Many believed they were in a more inappropriate relationship, wondering how this unlikely pair had come to share their lives. However, it wasn't their initial connection that captured the public's attention. It was the gruesome way their story ended. Days passed without any sign of movement from the rented house, prompting some curious neighbors to investigate. They found nothing unusual on the first floor, so they ventured upstairs. In the corner of a room, they discovered a pile of old clothes and a blanket used as a makeshift bed. But the true horror awaited them. The mutilated body of the young girl lay on top of the makeshift bedding, with no visible blood at the scene. The blood, it turned out, was located in another rented home in Sydney. There, pools of blood coated the floor, and the walls were smeared with crimson. In a chilling detail, an apparent axe mark in the wall bore traces of the girl's hair. It was evident that the old man had murdered her in one location and then transported her body to another. A doctor who examined the girl's remains reported multiple head wounds alongside bruises on her forehead and cheeks. Bite marks marred her chin, her ears were injured, and one of her fingers had been severed. Bruises on her torso indicated she may have endured brutal kicks. The old man was identified, possibly named Halloran or O'Hallen. Following the murder, he vanished without a trace, and no reports were ever found regarding his capture. The mystery of what transpired between the pair and the brutal end to their story remains a haunting tale of violence and tragedy. Number 5. Never pick up a stranger. In 1899, Clay Young met two men, Bush and Cooey, at a wagon yard in Muskogee, Oklahoma. The pair claimed they were headed to Arkansas, and Clay, looking for companionship on his journey, asked if he could join them. They agreed, and together they crossed the Arkansas River, continuing their travels by wagon for several more miles before stopping for the night. As the three men settled down in the wagon, Clay's thoughts began to turn dark. He realized that he could easily kill the other two men and take everything they owned, including their horses and wagon. The idea of murder became increasingly tempting, and while Bush and Cooey slept, Clay quietly grabbed a gun and an axe. Without hesitation, he struck Cooey on the head with the axe. The blow was enough to incapacitate him, but as Bush stirred awake, Clay quickly turned his attention to him, delivering a similar blow to the head. To ensure Bush wouldn't survive, Clay then pressed the gun to his neck and pulled the trigger. Just as Clay thought his work was done, Cooey began to regain consciousness. In a brutal act of finality, Clay raised the axe once more and crushed Cooey's skull, as if it were an eggshell. Bush, already suffering from a severe head injury and a gunshot wound, was still alive. Clay finished him off with another deadly swing of the axe. However, Clay's plans quickly unraveled. It turned out that the men had very little money on them. He was captured shortly after the bodies were discovered and confessed to the horrific acts without a hint of remorse. Clay Young was subsequently sentenced to life in prison, a grim reminder of the dangers that can arise from a seemingly innocent decision to travel with strangers. Number 4. Brained with an axe. In 1879, Andrew Manning lived in a factory village in Connecticut with his wife and adult children. He was known as a brute, frequently beating his wife, which led their children to grow increasingly frustrated with their father's violent behavior. In an attempt to put an end to the abuse, the children pooled their resources and gave Andrew money to leave the house for good. Andrew accepted their offer and left, but after spending all the money on rum, he returned home. When his wife answered the door, he pleaded to spend the night and rest. Despite the concerns of 2 of their daughters, who feared he would lash out again, the night passed uneventfully. In the morning, Andrew surprised everyone by giving his wife a warm kiss on the cheek and saying, "Goodbye, goodbye," as he left the house. The family assumed it would be the last time they would see him, but they were gravely mistaken. Instead of leaving for good, Andrew went next door and borrowed an axe from a neighbor. In a shocking turn of events, he dashed back into the house and buried the axe deep in his wife's head. She collapsed immediately, dead from the brutal attack. After committing the horrific act, Andrew fled to a nearby mill pond, stuffed his pockets full of stones, and jumped in, ending his own life. The town authorities later retrieved his body and buried it without ceremony, while his wife was honored with a full funeral, a stark contrast to the violence she endured in life. Number 3. Kept an axe by the bed. Harriet Williams, a hard-working woman in her 50s, was well respected in her North Carolina neighborhood. Known for her frugality, she worked 6 days a week in the city, returning to her modest cabin on Saturday nights to enjoy her Sundays in peace. On a spring morning in 1890, a neighbor was walking past her cabin, searching for his horse, when he heard faint groans coming from inside. Concerned, he opened the door and was met with a horrifying sight. Harriet lay on the floor, covered in blood, with 2 axes beside her. Terrified, the neighbor ran to fetch others, who quickly returned to the scene. They lifted poor Harriet onto a bed, but she passed away shortly thereafter. The coroner's examination revealed the brutality of the attack. Harriet had suffered 3 bloody and deep gashes to her head, a severe gash at her shoulder that cut to the bone, and injuries on both arms. It was discovered that Harriet had kept one of the axes at the head of her bed, while the other was positioned against the wall. When the intruder entered her room, she instinctively grabbed the axe by her bed, but her attacker seized the other. A desperate struggle ensued, but Harriet was ultimately overpowered. A search of her cabin indicated that some of the money she had hidden away was missing, yet a significant amount remained untouched. Despite the violence of the crime, the murderer was never identified, and no suspicious individuals had been reported in the area. The mystery of Harriet's brutal demise left the community in shock, highlighting the vulnerability of even the most diligent and respected among them. Number 2. Dreadful murder. In 1846, Benjamin Ellison lived with Elizabeth Ruth Salmon in a modest cottage in Penzance, England. One fateful night, Benjamin appeared at a nearby hotel and requested to stay there. When asked why he wouldn't return home, he replied that it was simply too late. Shortly after, he called a friend, and when the friend inquired about Elizabeth's well-being, Benjamin misleadingly claimed that she was, in fact, quite unwell. The following morning, Benjamin left the hotel and approached a neighbor near their cottage, claiming that someone had broken into their home and murdered Elizabeth. Alarmed, the neighbor alerted the authorities, who arrived at the scene to find a gruesome sight. Inside the cottage lay Elizabeth's butchered body, an axe resting ominously on the floor, surrounded by pools of blood. Her head was almost completely severed, and the back of her skull had been brutally smashed in. The body bore numerous cuts, indicating a violent struggle with her assailant. In a chilling detail, authorities discovered that Elizabeth was clutching a tuft of hair that appeared to match Benjamin's own. When examined, Benjamin's hands showed signs of bruising, and one of his fingers bore bite marks, suggesting a confrontation had taken place. He was swiftly taken into custody, and the evidence against him mounted. A jury ultimately delivered a verdict of willful murder, sealing Benjamin's fate in the eyes of the law. The horrific nature of the crime left the community in shock, questioning the motivations and darkness that could lead to such brutality within the confines of a seemingly ordinary life. Number 1. Off the top of his head. James P. Davis of Maine had spent time in the state insane asylum, deemed of unsound mind. However, he was eventually discharged as cured and returned home to live with his parents. On a spring morning in 1874, a horrific scene unfolded. His mother stepped outside into the yard and found her son standing over the lifeless body of his father, a bloody axe clutched in his hands. The top of the father's head had been gruesomely chopped off. Calmly, the mother spoke to her son, convincing him to put away the axe. She then led him inside the house, instructing him to wait there while she fetched the neighbors. They arrived quickly and took the troubled young man into custody. When questioned about why he had killed his father, Davis simply replied, "Washington ordered me to do it." Thank you for watching Creepshow. These tales of axe murders remind us that evil can lurk in the most familiar places, and that even the most mundane objects can become instruments of horror. If you found these stories as unsettling as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more spine-chilling content. What are your thoughts on these horrific events? Share your opinions in the comments below. Until next time, keep your doors locked and stay curious, because the darkness is always waiting.